one of my very favorite hymns. I want to start by thanking the Reverend Skylar Vogel and DJ Kashmir, who extended an invitation for me to join you today. I feel right at home here at Fourth Universalist because over 10 years ago, as you already heard, I was the director of religious education. And the last time I preached here, I gave a sermon titled, Eating Bacon as a Spiritual Practice. Bacon had quite an impact on, is this okay now? Okay. So the sermon was titled Eating Bacon as a Spiritual Practice, and it resulted in my getting a very angry email from an irate vegan who I tried to tell her just simply come to the sermon and hear how it is a metaphor for my life growing up Muslim and marrying a Jewish man. Anyway, that was a fun exchange when I was beginning my career as a religious educator. I've learned a lot since then. A picture of the marquee with the title is actually in the cookbook by Mark Samuelson, The New American Table. And unfortunately, that sermon is not recorded. So one day, maybe I'll be invited back to give an update. Today is not that day, however. Today, I'm going to focus on resiliency, Native Americans, and how learning the history of indigenous people of this land can help us living in these tumultuous and scary times. So I've lived in Seattle for the past 6 years, and one of the things that folks do at gatherings, whether it's meetings or public meetings or private meetings or in congregations, that I had not experienced anywhere else I've lived, and I've lived in 5 different states, including North Dakota, are land acknowledgements of the original inhabitants. DJ did that this morning so beautifully. Where I live in Seattle, and the UU Church that I currently serve as the Director of Lifelong Learning in Bellevue, Washington, is located on occupied land of the Duwamish people, and along the western coast are many tribes, namely the Coast Salish people, the Lummi Nation, Tillamook, Duwamish, and Chinook, just to name a very few of the many, many tribes that were displaced to make room for colonizers. It is important to note that these tribes are still fighting to save the salmon and to prevent other pipelines from being built on the western coast. As you heard this morning, the original inhabitants of New York City and northern New Jersey, according to what I could find on the internet, and thankfully it was the same thing that DJ read, were the Lenni Lenape and the Wappinger Lenape people. Now, I grew up in northern New Jersey. I went to graduate school in New York City, and I worked here at Fourth U, and it was not until this year that I found that out. I never knew or took the time to honor or acknowledge the people who lived and thrived on this land before colonization. For many of us who went through the elementary and high school systems in the United States, we were taught that Christopher Columbus came to a new world in 1492, and he discovered it trying to circumnavigate the world from Europe, traveling to India, not knowing there was an enormous landmass in the middle. I was taught the benign narrative that Columbus met some natives, claimed the land for Spain in the name of the monarchs who funded the endeavor, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Side note, I also learned living in Seattle that much of that money was stolen from Sephardic Jewish people populations and the Muslims who lived peacefully in Spain. When Columbus returned to Spain, he immediately wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella about his travels, and here is what he had to say in one of those letters about the Indians he encountered. Quote, "They are timid and full of terror, but when they see they are safe and all fear is banished, they are very guileless and honest, and very liberal of all they have. No one refuses the asker anything that he possesses. On the contrary, they themselves invite us to ask for it. They manifest the greatest affection toward all of us, exchanging valuable gifts for trifles, content with the very least or nothing at all." End quote. I found myself cringing at the line, "when they see they are safe." knowing what becomes of all the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, there was nothing safe then, and there is nothing safe now about how the indigenous populations in really every corner of the globe have been treated by colonizers and by unchecked, violent, extractive capitalism. One has only to look at the events in Brazil to know the attacks on indigenous people to extract natural resources continues in full force. In her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which I highly recommend, by the way, by the author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, she writes, quote, "By the end of the 1500s, the total population of what we now call the Western Hemisphere was about 100 million people. Approximately 40 million were in North America and Mexico. Central Mexico alone supported some 30 million people. For comparison, at that time, the population of all of Europe extending to the Ural Mountains in eastern Russia was about 70 million, end quote. Indigenous people knew how to cultivate the land, live in harmony with the land for thousands of years. Complex irrigation and agriculture techniques were well established and in fact were taught to the settlers and colonizers who needed to learn how to grow food in this unfamiliar land in which they arrived. I want to stop for a minute and ask that we think about what I just said. For thousands of years, different cultures and societies thrived while living in balance with nature, learning how to heal human ailments through medicinal plants and herbs, using water and natural resources in ways that did not exploit and plunder, rather in ways that allowed the land to regrow and flourish. It only took a couple of hundred years after the Industrial Revolution to find ourselves in the predicament we currently are in. Diseases that existed in Europe due to unsanitary conditions simply did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. When Europeans arrived en masse, they brought with them diseases that those alone killed thousands of indigenous people. Europeans also brought with them the notion of manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery. If you don't know what they are, simply put, it is the notion and decree put forth by the Catholic Church, naming that any land discovered with occupants that are not Christian can be taken as the divine rights of Christian people. Now, really, we understand that the doctrine of discovery was simply so that Spain can colonize this land and take it and claim it for themselves. So it was about power and greed. So when there are those who assert that the United States was founded on notions of greed and power, we have evidence to support this. Why am I telling you this? Why am I dwelling in the past as I have been accused of? Well, I'm working to center the voices of those who've been historically oppressed, marginalized, exterminated, and erased. I did not know this history until well into my 30s. I say this and I tell these snippets of history not to have anyone feel shame or guilt. Rather, it is with the hope that we learn from our collective past, the past of the land in which we occupy together. I hope that learning the true, ugly, and complex past will help all of us navigate what is surely an uncertain and frightening future. Despite decades of broken promises and broken treaties, first by the settlers and then by the United States government, hundreds of tribes remain active and committed to fighting for the earth and its precious and valuable resources. I wonder sometimes when we will realize that we cannot eat, breathe, or drink money. In 2017, the Standing Rock Sioux asked Christian leaders to come to North Dakota to ceremoniously repudiate the doctrine of discovery. Many Unitarian Universalist ministers, as well as ministers from many, many Christian denominations, answered the call to go to North Dakota and affirm the Standing Rock Sioux, and they ceremoniously, I believe, burned a copy of the Doctrine of Discovery. You heard me talk earlier about Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old from Sweden who sailed across the Atlantic and has clearly inspired millions of people around the globe to fight for climate. She met with the members of Standing Rock Sioux as she was invited, and she was honored by them, and she honored them in return, recognizing that they are the water protectors, fighting the pipeline threatening not only a major water supply, but also a sacred burial ground believed to hold the remains of Sitting Bull and Sacagawea. Greta knows that she has immense privilege with the attention she's been getting from all over the world. She's choosing to use that privilege to shine a light on Indigenous populations across the globe. As we sit here today, thousands and thousands of Indigenous people in Ecuador are protesting in the streets of Quito. They're protesting austerity measures proposed by the current president in order to secure a loan by the International Monetary Fund. The protesters have already seen the citizens of Ecuador have already seen food prices skyrocket. One example is that a bag of potatoes went from $20 to $60. In Brazil, thousands of Indigenous people have been fighting the destruction of the rainforest. That fight has been going on for decades. We are paying attention now because now less and less people can deny climate change with any real seriousness. And we understand now that we need trees, the lungs of the earth, to survive as a human race. So what does this have to do with resiliency and Unitarian Universalism, you might ask? I would argue that some of the most resilient people on earth are the ones that maintained their culture, their language, their rituals, and commitment to the earth. What Indigenous populations share all over the world is a dedication to the future and to balance with the earth that we need to sustain our life. In the book, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, Leadership for a Multicultural Age, the Latina author Juana Bordes highlights collaborative leadership models in three groups: Latinx, African American, and Indigenous people. She writes, quote, "Individualist cultures would have us believe that survival of the fittest was an every man for himself instinct in a dog-eat-dog competitive environment. In actuality, the collective lifted humans to the top of the evolutionary pyramid." In her notable book, Calling the Circle, visionary author Christina Baldwin uses the term first culture to refer to the time when humans lived in tribes or small communities in which everyone was needed and included and everyone belonged. Baldwin points out that human beings survived and thrived because of their ability to care for each other, work together, and help one another. We was our competitive evolutionary edge over other species. Survival of the fittest was a cooperative and reciprocal experience, end quote. It behooves all of us to look to more collective ways of being. Taking care of our neighbors, not only the neighbors we know, whether they are next door or down the block, but our global neighbors. Our neighbors from Central America who all they seek is a better life for themselves, for their children, and who are now being held in concentration camps in our name. This immigration discussion is one that hits close to home for me. I was born in Egypt. I came when I was less than 2 years old, and I did not become naturalized and get a piece of paper that declares I belong here until I was 19. It took 17 years. Our immigration system has always been broken and arbitrary, and I would argue racist. So every now and then I start to lose hope and I despair. Then I will reach out to a friend and let them know how much in despair I am and say, basically, humanity is screwed. What is the point? And they will remind me, thankfully, that humanity has been at the brink before and we've somehow turned things around. World War II, things looked awfully bleak. Then the Allied forces turned the tide and defeated the Nazis, and the world found hope again. I do have hope. I like to often quote James Baldwin, who said, "I cannot be a pessimist because I am alive. To be a pessimist means you have agreed that the human condition is one of an intellectual matter, and so I am forced to be an optimist." I have hope because for the first time, both in Unitarian Universalism and in the wider secular society, we are finally having the honest conversations about race, about power, about transphobia, misogyny, homophobia, and about violent extractive capitalism, a conversation we have been avoiding since the founding of this nation. I do have hope that Unitarian Universalist faith communities are places that are willing to continue to have the difficult and, yes, painful conversations that we need to have so that these conversations turn into plans of action that can make a difference in our hurting world. Unitarian Universalists, starting in the 80s, were at the forefront of the marriage equality movement. We affirm the rights of trans people to be affirmed in the fullness of their humanity. We affirm the movement for Black lives. We know how to do this. Unitarian Universalists know how to affirm the humanity of others. We believe and affirm the interdependent web of all existence. We have it in us to take the time to sit in discomfort, to listen, and be willing to be changed with our open hearts. I want to leave you with the words of the president, the current Unitarian Universalist president of the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. She wrote recently in a UU World magazine, speaking about the power of we, quote, "We don't create any real positive impact alone. Community gives us strength. Love gives us courage. Remembering we are not alone, remembering the people, the family, the community, the ancestors we belong to, gives us resiliency and power to keep on loving, keep on acting, keep on working for the values and commitments we hold dear. In movement and justice work, a shared commitment to a larger cause helps bond people together into a powerful we. It's one of the reasons that mission is so important to the health and vitality of a congregation. In the absence of mission, we can easily see ourselves as merely a collection of individuals. Purpose reminds us that we are in it together. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.